Hello everyone, I'm Darshana. So I was inspired to make this video after watching another video on YouTube called Pathogen Evolution in a Vaccinated World by um, Professor Andrew Reid. So he's actually, this is his profile. He's, I guess you could say he's an expert in the area of pathogen evolution, like evolution of pathogens like viruses, bacteria, and also different parasites, particularly under human intervention, like when you have uh, with drug interventions, vaccines, and pesticides, and so on. So, I would strongly recommend all of you to watch this particular video. It's almost just over 1 hour long, and it was published in 2016, so a few years back, but it's very relevant to the in the current context when we have covid, with this covid epidemic, as well as the uh, vaccines being purported as kind of a perhaps the most important intervention that humans can make. So the governments are really investing a lot on that, and um, you know coming up with certain programs, very kind of very persuasive programs to vaccinate the majority of the population. So um, and yeah, in that context it's very important, right? So what I did was I just came up with some I just extracted some screenshots from that presentation, because I just wanted to give uh, some thoughts of mine based on what he says, and also I basically wanted to kind of um, kind of give a summary of what he says, because it's a fairly technical presentation, so I'm not a domain expert in that area, but he and it seems most of the audience are domain experts, but still I think even he does it in such a way that even a lay person can get a pretty good handle on what he's talking about, right? Okay, so yeah, so basically the first thing that he um, points out is that human intervention, like for instance, drugs, when you intervene with drugs against parasites. So the example that he takes is malaria, which is a parasitic, which is a parasite. So throughout history, it has been shown to be resistant against certain drugs. So there are new drugs coming up, but the parasite somehow becomes resistant to that, and there's a new drug as a result of that. So he calls it a drug discovery treadmill. So it's like this treadmill that like a treadmill motion which never ends, and you keep on walking, but you are still at the same place, right? And so this is like a I guess widely accepted phenomenon. And even with things like antibiotics, I think there is, I guess, wide acceptance on this phenomenon called antibiotic resistance, where a bacteria would always try to evolve and become resistant to existing antibiotics, and um, perhaps leading to a superbug, right? So that has been a concern for a while, that some of the highly highly pathogenic bacteria becoming resistant to existing antibiotics. So pathogens becoming resistant to drug is kind of a well accepted phenomenon. So now his question is whether the same thing can happen, and what's important here is that anyway these parasites are going to evolve based on the theory of evolution, but whether the human intervention makes that evolution, expedites that evolution, and make it more virulent over time, right? So apparently, so I mean, with drug interventions, certainly that can happen. So his main question that he raises in the talk is whether vaccines, because that's also an intervention. Whether vaccines can also pressure the pathogen to evolve faster and become more virulent, right? Become more infectious. So now, first he points out certain examples from childhood vaccines, which apparently shows that it doesn't happen like that. Seems that these vaccines um, have held up pretty well against these. Basically, it seems that these pathogens have not escaped the immunity of the vaccines, and they haven't produced new variants and so on. So it seems the childhood vaccines are kind of a counter example for that argument, where it seems they are not evolving as due to uh, vaccine interventions, right? Except for pertussis, I think with pertussis there are some new variants that have come up, I guess, particularly in the US. So he points that out as well. But generally speaking, childhood vaccines, with the intervention of childhood vaccines, his argument is that we haven't seen that kind of um, evolutionary pressure for the pathogen to evolve faster or evolve into more virulent variants. Now, so he asked whether it's possible to make a general statement saying that vaccines are evolution proof, unlike drugs. So with drugs, we know that it can expedite the evolution of the pathogen, but whether vaccines are not like that. And the term evolution proof refers, in this context, it refers to the fact that so you intervene with the vaccine, but that does not cause, so I mean there's no additional pressure on the pathogen to um, evolve faster, right? And he counters that argument saying that this cannot be generalized. So there are mainly four reasons that he brings out why this cannot be right in a general context, as a general statement, right? Of course, this can be correct for a specific vaccine, but as a general statement, he says that this cannot be correct. One reason is already there are some diseases for which it's very hard to develop a vaccine, and they seem to be vaccine resistant. Things like HIV, malaria, and even flu, because even with flu, we have seen that, particularly in Western countries, in where they have colder climates, during winter, every winter there's a new flu vaccine, right? So it's not the same flu vaccine that you get next year, because apparently the flu virus evolves now. So that's kind of a that kinds of gives a hint that it may be vaccine resistant or over long term, right? The other reason is that there are some observations that have been made where apparently pathogen evolution seems to be happening. So these are not really, I guess, controlled trials, but controlled experiments, but observations based on population where vaccines are being rolled out. Vaccines have been rolled out against certain illnesses. Like so, he cites book chapter written by him and some other author, and there are some you know historical case studies in different countries with different illnesses, where just after a vaccination campaign has started, there has been a rise in new mutants, new variants, and new kinds of antibodies that are not supposed to be there observed in people. So it's not the vaccine induced antibodies, some other antibodies, suggesting that there are new variants. So like that, there have been some observations made uh, in certain scenarios. And the other important thing, I think this is the most important point in terms of this talk, because he's talking a lot about animal vaccines, vaccines that target dogs, cats, and chicken, and animals like that, domesticated animals. So they apparently have, there are cases where vaccines have failed in the phase of pathogen evolution. So this is one famous example that he cites, this virus that targets cats. So in two categories, where large number of cats are kept, I guess, maybe abandoned cats or something, in two different locations. The independent variants have come up, so where all the cats were vaccinated, and basically the new variant wiped out, exterminated the entire population in both the cases, right? So hyper virulent strains coming up. And the other thing is vaccines can impose novel selection. That is, as I understand what he's referring there is, what he elaborates on is, now with the natural antibodies, that those are like for the whole virus, but when you come up with vaccines that are based on a particular genetic segment of a particular virus. Now, for example, these mRNA vaccines and DNA vaccines use the spike protein, right, which is a genetic specific segment of a virus, not the whole virus. So then antibodies are developed for that, and there can be new selection that targets that particular specific antibody, which is something that won't happen naturally, right? So that can create new variants. That's another point that he brings out, to say that vaccines, as a general statement, you can't say that vaccines are evolution proof. That means, with at least with certain vaccinations, with certain kinds of disease, the vaccines might expedite the evolution, or, or facilitate the evolution, uh, compared to the natural evolution of a pathogen, right? So again, if you go back to this idea of childhood vaccines, now he takes this example, this, I guess, a famous data set in immunology, where measles vaccine, once it has been rolled out in England and Wales, it has been observed the number of cases. These cases have gone down dramatically, and so what we can see is, apparently the vaccine is working, and it seems that it has not popped out new mutants, right? So that's a good thing, right? That means vaccine is working, and it's kind of what you call evolution proof. But if we, so it goes back to this original scenario as well. Even in here, it seems that after the pathogen infections reaches a certain peak, now even in here, there's a huge pressure on that pathogen to virus to create a variant, right? But it has not happened all this time, right? So what he says is, even naturally this particular disease seems to be evolution proof, even under a lot of pressure, even at these peaks, because it cannot find any other person to infect, but still it has not created a mutant, right? So he says it's not really clear why that happens, but anyway, naturally also it seems evolution proof. So his hypothesis is that a vaccine would be evolution proof if that particular disease, even the natural immunity is evolution proof, right? In that cases, because vaccines sort of mimic the natural immunity, or the infection that you gain from immunity that you gain from normal infection. If vaccines mimic that, then if the natural immunity here also appears to be evolution proof, then maybe vaccine induced immunity might be working the same way. So that's, I think, a good way to understand it. When vaccines work, they might be working in infections which are naturally evolution proof, right? So all these vaccines are things like that. And again, pertussis, there's a question mark against pertussis, because I think recently in the US there have been outbreaks despite the vaccination, right? Okay, so this is a very important idea, because we can, this way we can understand, or we can sort of predict when a vaccine will be evolution proof and when it won't. Now, on the contrary, there are other vaccines that are not naturally evolution proof. There are other infections that are not naturally evolution proof. For example, flu, and even pertussis is listed here, and some other hepatitis and all that. and there are vaccines under development for certain illnesses, malaria, HIV. Again, this problem with the new variants, new mutants coming up is a problem there, right? So his hypothesis is that if a illness is not naturally evolution proof, right? So you can get flu this year and next year also you can get flu, then the vaccine also may not be evolution proof, right? So in these kind of situations, particularly in flu, I think we have experienced that over many years, that a pathogen will evolve in response to vaccination, right? When an infection is not natural evolution proof. Now, this is important with the context of COVID, because COVID also seems to be not evolution proof, because it seems that the new variants are coming up um, that can bypass the immunity that you obtain from the original infection. So um, yeah, so this is important with the current context in terms of COVID and COVID vaccines. So then he goes on to explain different ways that vaccine induced evolution can happen. The conventional idea is that there will be some what you call escape variants that escape the immunity that you obtain through vaccination, right? So this is how usually the flu variants are explained. But he brings up another possible way that this can happen. So I think this is kind of the novelty in this idea, the idea that he proposes, the idea of virulence, right? Without a new escape variant coming up, he says that in response to vaccination, a pathogen can become more virulent. It can cause more harm, or more can cause more harm to the host, right? So, and he cites certain examples, like literature for that. So I think this is the key idea here. This is actually I guess most of us are already familiar with this idea because of flu. Now, to test this idea of virulence, he and a colleague of his, this particular lady, and they had done this particular experiment where they use a malaria parasite, and then creates replicas of that. So they infect it to, like, they take mice, and they create another a separate line of mice which are called naive mice that are not infected, right? And they infect with a certain, I guess, experimental vaccine, and the vaccinated mice are also infected, right? So this is the parasite lineage over time of those mice. And so what we can see is that with unvaccinated mice, the lineage is, the parasite can sustain for a long time in a particular mouse. So that makes sense. And here in the vaccinated mice, the the strains die out pretty quickly. So that is to be expected, and that shows that the vaccine works. But what you can see is that after many generations, the parasite becomes it can sustain longer and longer in the mice, even in the vaccinated mice, right? So that's kind of evidence that it is somehow becoming more it is somehow becoming more robust against the vaccination, right? So then they go to one more step. They take different strains from each of these uh, strains, like each of these iterations take different pathogen strains from each of these iterated points, and they infect those pathogens of malaria parasite into unvaccinated mice, like brand new set of mice, right? To see if these strains are more virulent than the strains that are coming through the unvaccinated mice, right? So when they do that, the strains that that go through the vaccinated mice actually cause more severe symptoms. So here they measure the red cell density. I guess that is something that they measure in malaria that affect mice, and so it causes a bigger loss of red cell density after many more iterations, right? So compared to the strains that are coming through unvaccinated mice. So that means that these strains have become more virulent after going through the vaccinated mice. And the interesting thing here is that he says that uh, it's the genetic structure of these strains are identical. So there's no genetic mutation or anything like that, but somehow they have become more virulent. So I found it very interesting how could that happen, because usually with a very primitive organism like a parasite, we would think that all the changes of behavior, its behavior is due to, it's encoded in the genes, right? But so if I understood it correctly from what he said, it seems that it has become more virulent without changing the genetic information. I'm not sure how that happens. It's like an idea of a collective consciousness or a um, collective operation. So it would be interesting to explore that more. I think why how that could happen without having any genetic mutation. How could a pathogen become more virulent, right? So then the outcome of this experiment is that vaccination in this particular case promotes the evolution of virulence, right? It's the virulence is the harm that is caused by the pathogen, right? It promotes that. Vaccination promotes that. So it may not affect the vaccinated mice, but if the pathogen gets infected to new unvaccinated mice, it will cause more harm than this particular lineage, right? Okay, so that's one idea that he comes up with in terms of the evolution of virulence. Now, then he asks another important question. Again, this is important with in the current context, whether when you have multiple strains of the same virus, where you have some strains that are less harmful, less virulent, some strains that are more virulent, what could happen if you have when you have a vaccination campaign, right? Which strain will become more dominant, right? So again, there's this general question that is asked when you so he points out the reason why aren't super virulent, super hot viruses in nature that can basically wipe out any species. That's because so this, I think, the general idea that if you have a super hot strain, super hot virus, that would kill the host very quickly, right? So even for the virus to survive, the host has to live longer to spread that virus, right? So and when you have a super hot strain or a super hot virus, that will die out, and when the host dies, it kind of it's I guess the nature's way of preventing that disease from spreading further, right? So and that is yeah, that's I thought that's an interesting idea. And now what happens is, if you vaccinate a person, right, maybe that person becomes and the another outcome of this is that over time, naturally, pathogen should become less and less virulent, because it, if it wants to spread more, right, it has to make sure that the host does not die, right? So over time, naturally, if there's no intervention, naturally a pathogen should become less and less virulent over time, right, if there's no intervention. Now if you vaccinate a person like this, then what could happen is they might survive, right? They might survive and they might have mild symptoms, which means that they can infect someone else. And if the other person is also vaccinated, that they might be they might not die, they might survive and they might have mild symptoms. But since this is a super hot variant, if he interacts with someone who's not vaccinated, so that person may have a bad outcome, right, compared to the previous case, because in the previous case you wouldn't have met that person. That person might be either bedridden or that person might be dead, right? So it's, in any case, some people, some portion of the society is sacrificed, right? So the question is which has a bigger impact in the end, I guess. So the argument is that vaccines protect virulent pathogens from themselves. That is, if you have a super virulent pathogen, super hot variant that can, it by killing the host, it's kind of killing itself. But when you do the vaccination, that it can sustain longer, right? So vaccines allow more virulent strains to circulate. So that's a hypothesis. Again, it's a hypothesis that he brings forth, and then he comes up with an experiment to test this hypothesis as well. So based on a virus that affects chicken called Marek's disease virus. So it's a very dangerous disease for chicken apparently, and originally this particular virus caused, this kind of uh, paralysis kind of symptoms, and now actually it has over time become more and more virulent, and now a lot of chicken die from that, and over time it has, the virulent strains have incurred observed to be causing a lot of internal organ damage, right? So so he's using this particular animal virus to test out this idea. So and this is also how the illness has evolved over time, and there are new vaccines. Couple of times new vaccines have been introduced because the vaccines have become ineffective after some time. So again, this kind of shows kind of a treadmill, vaccine treadmill coming up. Of course, with flu vaccine, I guess we have a vaccine treadmill. So with this animal vaccine, animal virus also, we can see sort of a treadmill being developed, right? And so but there are textbooks written on this, and this is like a widely accepted phenomenon, where it says virus evolution undermined two generations of vaccines. And again, vaccine failure was not due to antigenic variations, or not due to new variants coming up. It's just due to the evolution of virulence, right? The virus becoming more virulent. Again, it's a very interesting idea. I don't know how that is explained, but yeah. um, Now, so again, this shows how the severity of the symptoms have increased over time. um, and now the question here is, if you have multiple strains in the society circulating, when you do vaccination and when you don't do vaccination, which strain will become more prominent or more dominant, right? So to test this, he takes 5 different strains. These like the ancestral virus, original virus, and even that kills. So a broiler will have 60 days. You take a 60-day. So he takes a chicken that live for 60 days, and before they are slaughtered, and the original strain killed 50% of the chicken, right? So even that is a very dangerous virus. But because I think in COVID, with COVID, I guess now it's around 1%, which is still pretty problematic, right? But you can imagine that with 50%, it's a very highly virulent um, strain. But this is the most kind of harmless strain out of the other strains. So other strains like kill of most birds, and some of these strains, so this last one is the most virulent, which basically kills everything within 10 days, right? Now, so naturally, I think because of this phenomena that is introduced here, that is explained here, that naturally usually the dominant strains will be the less virulent ones. But he wants to test what will happen if you vaccinate, right? Which strain will become more prominent, right? So to test this, he comes up with this experiment, and he has in his team where they place chicken chicks actually in this kind of a chamber, and it has a air coming in and air coming out through a filter, and they can catch the particles. So basically this virus spreads through some kind of a particle that comes up of chicken wings, and they can capture it and measure the viral load in the environment, viral density in the environment. um, so these are the kinds of things that you can't do with humans with due to ethical reasons, but here they use animals to do that. And but it's a very important experiment in a sense. So when they just test it with test the viral particles without any vaccination, so these are less virulent variants, so they linger longer in the environment, and they catch, or they can measure a higher load of these particles. So the less virulent strains last longer, and the higher load of uh, those viral particles are there in the environment, and the higher virulent variants are less prominent, right? Because when the chicks are infected with the higher virulent, the chicks are infected with the higher virulent variants, they die quickly, right? So that means they can't spread the higher, the more virulent strains. Now, when you vaccinate the population, things change. The Even the higher virulent, like more virulent strains, sustain longer, right? And so that's kind of proves that hypothesis that vaccination actually enables the more virulent strains to persist in the environment, right? Um, and this is again a bar chart showing that difference, the shedding of the viral strains. So when you have an unvaccinated situation, these are like less virulent strains, those are the dominant ones in the environment. But when you vaccinate, things sort of reverse, right? The more virulent strains become more prominent because those chicks survive, right? Those chicks survive, but they shed the virus. So this kind of proves his hypothesis that um, the vaccination has an impact on the sustainability of the more virulent strains. Right? And now again, they go a step further, and they try this experiment where they experimentally infect some chicks with a more virulent variant, right? And all of them turn up dead. So nobody is vaccinated here. All of them turn up dead, but the others survive because these chicks, they die by the day 10. That means they might be shedding for 1 or 2 days, and but they die quickly, right? So that means they can't shed that virulent strain. But when you vaccinate, so they survive, but the others die. Unvaccinated die because they live to shed that virus, right? The more virulent virus strain, right? So it's kind of a dilemma here, because if you are not vaccinated, you end up dead, but previously you live because you don't encounter this highly pathogenic strain, right? um, and then they try another experiment there where they vaccinate the mothers, the hen, and so their chicks inherit some resilience against the virus, but they too die, but they live longer before they die, right? Previously everybody died by day 11, but here they start by dying by day 11. And previously the unvaccinated lived, but here uh, basically everyone dies. So these guys also die because the these chicks shed the more virulent strain, and they also die because their immunity is not that strong, because they inherited that from their mother. They were not vaccinated. So it's kind of a dilemma here, because here everyone ends up dying, which is like the worst case scenario if you have like a partial immunity here. So this is so did vaccination make Marek's disease virulent? Yeah, so basically, uh, he says that vaccination is sufficient to explain the persistence of hot strains. Right? Vaccination can make possible the circulation of strains otherwise too lethal to persist. Without vaccines, it will these lethal strains will infect some people, but or some animals, but they won't be able to spread it. Right? Because they will turn up dead or critically ill, or they might not be able to move, or something like that. But with vaccination they can shed it long, and that virulent strain will survive longer in the environment, right? So now this is, so it's interesting to see whether, so it's very difficult to do something like this with humans, but he points out some observational study from India from some time back, like some historical data where a hospital or some region in India was vaccinated against diphtheria, and the so the cases dropped, but the case fatality rate increased, right, over time. And in the original paper, I think he says that the argument explanation given to this was that the funding for the hospital was less, and that increases the increased case fatality rate. But he says it may be due to the evolution of virulence. So only way to test that is to take strain from here and here and infect a brand new group of people and see who turn up dead more, right? Because obviously you can't do that due to ethical reasons. So that's why they have to be content with these animal experiments. So this is important. So it's important in the current context is how this will affect COVID and current vaccines. And the first thing is whether uh, are all vaccines or can all vaccines cause this kind of survival of the hotter strains, right? So he brings up certain arguments, certain things to look for. One is if a vaccine cannot prevent transmission, that it only reduces the symptoms or the death rate, then it's a evolutionarily risky vaccine, right? Because it allows these hotter strains to transmit through the vaccinated person. And it only if a vaccine targets only a subset of strains, again it's a problematic, a risky vaccine. So there are some points given that things to look for, and it's interesting because I think even COVID vaccines, so usually the understanding is the current vaccines in the market, they are not specifically targeted to stop transmission so that you can transmit to some other person. That's why you have to wear a mask and all that even after vaccination. But the symptoms will be lower. That's the kind of the official story most of the time, I guess. So that makes it evolutionarily risky according to his argument, because that means more virulent strains can persist longer in the society. um, Now what are the implications for on this on COVID based on this? Because one argument that you can say is, okay, that means you have to vaccinate everyone, because if these six were also vaccinated they would have lived, right? In this case, right? Now there are some practical problems here. I mean, one problem is some people might refuse to get vaccinated. You can say, okay, that's too bad for them, they ask for it. The other issue is you can't vaccinate everyone. I mean, practically it's a very difficult task because it's a huge operation. If you take a country, even I think in Sri Lanka, by the end of this year, it's the official plan is to have 60% of the people vaccinated. So that means there's another 40% that are not vaccinated, and some people might not be eligible because of health reasons. I think current vaccines are not generally administered to pregnant women, right? So that they might be at risk. Actually, I saw an article today, and that which said that there are some pregnant women who have succumbed to COVID, and it seems that pregnant women and children are apparently more vulnerable to the new strains, right? So whether this kind of a phenomenon can make them more vulnerable or more make them more exposed to those strains, because so they might get it from a vaccinated through a vaccinated person, and because of the lack of testing and all that, you cannot vaccinate pregnant people, pregnant women or children, right? So in a practical sense, there will be a significant portion of a society that are not vaccinated, which will be at a higher risk of encountering a more virulent hot strain, right? So it is, I think that is something that the experts, I guess, would have to really think through, uh, whether it can have some negative implications. And actually, Professor Reed had written an article in this Conversation magazine last November. Virus evolution could undermine a COVID 19 vaccine, but this can be stopped. And there at the end, he highlights um, certain points. So, the idea of uh, an evolution proof vaccine, right? So what he's proposing is evolution proof vaccine or evolution proof vaccines where he mainly points out three things that we should have in vaccines that feed three features. First, they are highly effective at suppressing viral replication. That stops further transmission. No replication, no transmission, no evolution. Right. So this is again questionable with, I guess, most or all of the current vaccines, because the general statement that we hear from the most experts and in the media is that they reduce the symptoms. They may not reduce transmission, right? And evolution proof vaccines induce immune responses that attack several different parts of the microbe. That is, I guess, the Chinese vaccine is kind of a little ahead in this regard, because it's, I guess, a whole based on the whole inactivated virus. But mRNA vaccines and DNA vaccines, they only target this spike protein. So again, this kind of is questionable here with the current vaccines. And third, evolution proof vaccines protect against all circulating strains. So this is also a problem, because the south, I guess, the in some cases current vaccines have been shown to be ineffective with some of the strains, like the South African strain, or sometimes it's not just um, tested, right? Because when you have a vaccine that is only protecting against a certain strain, the other strain, which may be more virulent, these strains are also competing with each other. The more virulent strain will take over and become more dominant, right? Currently, it may not be the dominant strain. Currently, it may be a less virulent strain. But if you suppress only the less virulent strain, the more virulent strain takes over and become like that. That's what he says. No others can fill the vacuum when competitors are removed, right? But here there are others that can fill the vacuum. So when you have more virulent strains circulating, that's not good. And even the vaccinated, now when a highly virulent strain becomes the dominant one, over time, I guess, so he doesn't talk about it, but over time, I guess, even the vaccinated individuals might be at risk, because there might be a new variant of that highly pathogenic strain, right? Which is now the dominant strain, like in this cat example. So there's a new variant that escapes the immunity of the vaccinated one. So here all the cats were vaccinated, but still they died because there was a new super hot strain. So if, I guess, it's in the best interest for everyone to have a less virulent strain as the dominant strain, and not a highly virulent or super hot strain as the dominant strain, right? Even for the vaccinated people in the long run. So so I think that so those are some very important points that he's making, I think, which should be you know part of the discussion at least. um, and we can see that even in Sri Lanka, there's this article says that 6 different strains have been identified in Sri Lanka. I guess in most countries now these strains are there, and some of them have become resistant to the immunity of vaccines and so on. Uh, so and there was this interview by Professor Shahid Jameel, who's, I guess, uh, uh, chairman of some kind of a government organization in India that studies these strains, and he had said that the Indian variant is resistant to the immunity induced by all the vaccines that are used in India, and so on. So I think that sentiment was repeated by uh, WHO scientists as well. So yeah, so that means that there are variants that already are resistant to the vaccines. So and whether that can vaccination, mass vaccination can give it a comparative advantage. That's something that we have to think about. And this particular article talks about again about vaccines, mutants escaping the vaccine induced immunity, where in Israel they have looked at um, the South African variant, right? And apparently there's something interesting happening here. Here we performed a case control study that examined whether the Pfizer vaccine with COVID infection were more likely to become infected with the UK and South African variant, and they observed that the unvaccinated, so vaccine is infected at least a week after the second dose, were disproportionately infected with South African variant 8 times more compared to the unvaccinated. So there actually it's something interesting. It seems that the vaccinated people are infected with the more virulent variant even more than the unvaccinated people. So I think it might be another phenomenon called original antigenic sin that is discussed in the immunology literature that might be happening there. So these, but main thing is there are already strains that are resistant to vaccines, right? So then uh, based on his third point that he is uh, praising here, whether that could actually be an advantage, vaccination can be an advantage to those hot variants, right? They can become more dominant, they don't face any competition. And so we have seen some news last few days about COVID surging in countries where with the highest vaccinated rates sometimes. So maybe this is due to the new variants and so on. And maybe some of the things that was discussed in this original talk are at play here. Maybe it's due to the variants gaining a competitive advantage, right? So we don't know. I think it's very difficult to say with observation like this. Even in Seychelles, which is perhaps the most vaccinated nation in terms of the percentage, it's experiencing a surge. So all these things kind of point to some interesting development. So it's a very complex, I guess, these immune reactions. And if you particularly look at the entire population, when multiple strains are at play, I think it's not very straightforward. At least it can be very complicated, and I think there has to be a serious discussion by the experts um, to see whether there are any pros and cons in the current strategy, right? Particularly when there are strains circulating that can be, so of course even a vaccine works against all strains. Obviously you can't immunize everyone because of obvious reasons, like pregnant women and all that. Whether they are, whether you are putting them at more risk because they might be exposed to more highly pathogenic variants, or even worse when some strains appear to be resistant against current vaccines, whether we are actually indirectly giving them a comparative advantage, right? So those are like difficult problems to tackle like this. And I think some serious discussion is warranted with the current policies. uh, if you look at the ideas that he brings forth. So again, I would like to recommend everyone to watch this particular video, because I think it's a very informative and important video in the current climate. And it was recorded, it was published a few years back, so COVID is not discussed there, but the ideas that are discussed there are very relevant to COVID and all these talk about multiple strains and the vaccination strategy and so on. And COVID being a very seems it's a evolutionary proof. Um, it's not a evolutionary proof illness because even in the case of seizures, apparently more than a third of the people who were infected were fully vaccinated people, right? So COVID apparently is not a evolution. Naturally, it's not evolutionary proof illness. So that means vaccines may be causing or maybe allowing or facilitating the evolution of more pathogenic strains based on Professor Reed's ideas, and we cannot say that for sure unless we test that in a control trial. But I guess based on his ideas, it's certainly a possibility, right? Okay, so with that, I'd like to conclude. And if you have any thoughts, feel free to add that in the comment section, and I will share all these references in the discussion. Sorry, in the description. And thanks for watching, and see you again with a similar video. Thank you.